Just switching gears a little bit to perhaps the book and some of the more philosophical matters that unfortunately don't get discussed perhaps as much as they should. So that's why we need you to weigh in on some of these topics. When it came to writing the book, there's a lot of personal experiences in here that are are completely unique and very personal for you. Was it a difficult emotional process creating this book, and did you have second thoughts about putting this out into the public? Because it's kind of a reveal of your character, of your development.
Well, remember the book was written for the public.
Mm-hmm.
The book was a set of notes for my students who might or might not have the opportunity to go to Okinawa. And what I wanted to do with those notes, for those who couldn't go, I wanted them to give them some sense of what I had been talking about in the dojo over the course of years. For those who were able to go, I knew that Okinawa was constantly changing. And I didn't know whether they were going to see the same Okinawa that I saw. So I wanted to give them a base, so to speak, of what their teacher had seen and experienced. So in that sense, and I knew, just like when you teach Marines, you can't just teach tactics, you have to teach the intensity of the battlefield. What is it like to pull a trigger? So I wanted to get that sense across to them. The hard part was initially you have to decide what goes in and what stays out. It's easy to put a whole bunch of stuff in, but you want to make sure you're not talking about yourself so much and your personal experience, but you do want to flavor the book with enough. So it was somewhat difficult. I did want to put something in there about the racial environment. I certainly wanted to talk a lot about the history, the grand history of Okinawa, and how I felt sorely mistreated by the Japanese even to this day. The role of Marines, the brutality of the battle for Okinawa, and how the Okinawan character brought them above all of that. And then some of the personal things, as I mentioned, the racial issues, what had happened to the Marine Corps. It had gone into a little valley and kind of lost its way for a while in the 60s, as had much of the country. It was a reflection of the country. So that was difficult.
In regards to the Okinawan character that you just mentioned, one of the terms you use is Hinkaku, which is a bit of a special dignity that can be portrayed only after significant study. Can you talk a little bit more about what that is, and perhaps an example or two that you noticed, you really noticed in some of the seniors when you were over there?
For senior martial artists on Okinawa, especially back in the 60s and even in the 70s, less so now, these were gentlemen who had survived the war. They had seen the worst. They were at the receiving end of brutality that they did not deserve, the culture did not deserve. Their cousins, their nephews, their brothers, their grandmothers, blown away by the Japanese or by American forces. Many of the bodies never found, washed out to sea, simply destroyed on the battlefield, not properly buried. They'd seen their entire culture debased by the Japanese and or destroyed, including Shuri Castle, which was completely reduced to rubble during the battle. And so they had to come up with a starting point, and the starting point was inside of them. And that's where Hinkaku starts. The dignity of a senior starts with their personal character. So they had to reach back inside. They had to remember their religion, their own history, and they had to reconstruct much of that because many of the records were lost during the war. And so what we found were repositories for those things in gentlemen who also happen to be martial artists. Karate is something that we do, and it's something that we feel, it's something that we think about. So those folks who did that well became repositories, they became walking cultural centers themselves. And just as with my instructor, the role of the Hanshi is very interesting on Okinawa. He's not only a karate master, but people, I'm sure they still do, but while I was on Okinawa, they would come to my teacher to ask him to decide on a name for their children, when to plant their crops. He was a very special person in the community. And they trusted his judgment. And the more that trust is given, the more responsible those people become. And then a certain dignity comes from that. You got to see it expressed, or I got to see it expressed. One instance, Katsuya Miyahira Sensei from Shidokan, Shorin, he was a student of Shibana Sensei. I watched him do Pasai Dai Kata one day, and from the very beginning, he had been sitting quietly in a chair off on the side of the demonstration area. And a number of other seniors came out and performed, and very good. The minute he stood up, it was almost as if the room became just charged. You could feel this rumble. His personal power came onto the stage. He stepped up, looked around for a minute, and the place was just filled with thousands of people. And it was as if he was looking at an empty sugarcane field. This is a nice place for me to come outside. There's nobody here. And it was as if he took a few seconds to gather himself. And I always used to wonder what the gentleman would like that thing. And this is just my thought, that he would look out and he was looking at his country. He was looking at the destroyed castles, the destroyed villages, all the pain and hurt. How can I overcome this? By doing Masadai. And this dignity, this Hinkaku came out of him. Every move was regal. It was like watching a king, like a true king, walk past or perform a kata. And of course, the timing was such you could almost hear Okinawan music playing. You could see his moves actually having effect on an enemy. And at the end of the performance, just about everybody was just slack-jawed. We knew we had seen something very special. And again, at the end, he bowed, not to anybody in the crowd. It was just an empty sugarcane field he was looking at. Turned around and simply walked off. But when he walked off, you could almost see little sparkles of stars or something there. He just had this power, and he sat down, and the energy was just reabsorbed. And he was just quiet, gentle person. And I have not seen that here in the States. And so I'm spoiled. I tell folks I'm spoiled. I actually used to have 8th and 9th on to him. What do you think of my kata? I said, well, let me tell you who I've seen before. And if you want an honest opinion, I had to give it to you in relation to some just extraordinary people. But that's an example of Hinkaku. And stayed with me.
I don't know if this plays into it or not, but you mentioned that Shimabukuro Sensei would have you guys train out in nature, on the beach, just outside the dojo, just kind of in the natural Okinawan experience. That's obviously de-emphasized due to the fact that it's not street practical. So a lot of modern systems don't find the value of the time for it because you only have a limited amount of time with students. Do you feel that nature training was part of the Hinkaku process, and how important do you feel it is in your training and perhaps for others?
I think it's important because I never did well during that kind of training. And I think that was Sensei's point. He would remind us that when he was a young man, the most likely time you would be attacked would be walking from village to village, outdoors somewhere. No one's going to walk into your dojo and say, you, me, on the floor now. There's going to be someone hiding behind a tree or a rock while you're strolling from village to village. You want to sell a chicken or so. So he felt that was very important. I related to that to Marine Corps jungle training and how we would just do patrolling. At least up here, the weapons were different, but the mindset was the same. So he, in fact, one of Sensei's training films, if I can call it that, has him outdoors quite a bit. He does some work in the dojo, but there's a reason he does a lot of things outdoors. He always wanted us to be connected with nature. He felt that karate was a part of nature. We talk about shizentai a lot, natural movement or nature movement. We should move as nature intends us to move. We should train with the rhythm of water. I've mentioned in the book the rhythm of the rolling waves in the Pacific. The air, sometimes we would train in bad weather. Sensei would think that he thought there was something the matter with us when we did that. But we thought we were following the path that he set. But it seemed to be a good way to break you from the habit. We're always trying to disrupt habits or patterns. Once you develop a pattern, folks can pick up on that and take advantage of it. So Sensei was always throwing something in there. What does your Seisan kata look when you're practicing in the sand? What does it look like when you're in the water? Is that the time to use Sanchin? And so he would force us back and forth to consider those things. And what it did was it dragged us from the middle of our comfort zone. Like we always say, most folks, and I was as well, you develop that little place where you're right in the middle of your comfort zone. But you only make progress at the edge of your comfort zone. So Sensei was always pushing us.